Good evening. Hope we are all well. So you'll have to forgive me. I'm using a new bit of software for this webinar today. So this will be a little bit of a trial and error with certain things, but hopefully it will all go well. So I can see that the room is filling up quite nicely. And yeah, I won't take any time kind of jumping into this. So what I wanted to do with this webinar is I really wanted to give everyone some actionable advice that they could go away with in order to be able to apply this to their own journeys, to have a lot more understanding with things sort of moving forward. And I've tried to condense it down to the things that I think are going to be the most beneficial, because with fat loss, such a wide topic, there's so many different areas that I could look to go down with this, but I thought I would try and keep it simple as and actionable as possible. Now, you may see things down the side here, like we have a chat bar. We also have essentially a place where I can bring up some things like some files that I have available there for a few of the things that we'll be looking to kind of cover as we go through this. So there's some forms and things that you'll have access to if you want to. And also as well, if you go to the files tab, you will see that there is a download which has some non-tracking approaches to dieting. So essentially ways that you can manage and limit calorie intake without having to track them, without having to calorie count and things like that. So that's available there as a PDF. You can essentially just download at any time. So I've just shared that with everyone now, and you can download that at any point during the talk. Okay, so on we go. And we're just going to start with the boring but important bit, and it's probably something that many of you already well know. I'm sure most of you know the importance of calories and a calorie deficit. However, what a lot of people don't always think about is the adherence factor. So how well can you stick to your diet? Because obviously a diet can be the absolute most perfect diet on paper, but if it's something you can't stick to, then obviously it is not going to be effective for your results. And we essentially want to have a nice balance between something that we can stick to for the period of time we want to diet for, that also has this calorie deficit in place. So adherence, the most important factor when it comes to moving into a fat loss diet. An emerging body of evidence suggests that a high level of adherence to a diet, regardless of the type of the diet, is an important factor in weight loss success over the short and long term. So it doesn't matter if a diet is a ketogenic diet, it doesn't matter if it's extremely high carbohydrate, it doesn't matter if it's full of junk foods. At the end of the day, the main thing that's important is whether somebody can stick to it whilst being in a calorie deficit. Now, typically when people think about adherence, it has to be a diet they stick to, they think about it being very slow weight loss. When in reality, often the opposite is the case. And this is something that I wanted to speak a little bit about, is that a diet doesn't have to mean weight loss has to be slow in order for you to be able to adhere to it. So, it's a slow, sustainable approach. Always used to be this feeling that the faster you lost weight, the quicker you'd put it back on. However, the research doesn't actually support this. The research supports that actually in populations that they've studied, the quicker the weight loss there was, the better they actually kept it off long term. And it kind of disproves that theory of, losing weight quickly for everyone means they're going to put it back on a lot quicker. It's not actually the case. It's not kind of the way things actually work. There is a very, individual variety when it comes to this. So findings indicate that both short and long-term advantages to fast initial weight loss. Fast weight losers obtained greater weight reduction and long-term maintenance, and were not more susceptible to weight regain than gradual weight losers. So this is something to think about if previously you've thought that you always have to kind of go the slow and steady approach, and it's just something that hasn't essentially worked that well for you. Right, okay, let's just have a look to see. I can see that few people lost it. Perfect, cool. Right, so this is something to ask yourself before you move into a fat loss phase. So first of all, how much weight do you need to lose? Obviously, the larger amount of weight that you need to lose, the longer it's going to mean that you would essentially need to diet for, especially if you're dieting for especially if you're dieting obviously at a much slower rate. So ask yourself, how much do you need to lose? Obviously, you're not going to lose it all in 2 to 4 weeks. But this is something that we need to pay attention to, especially because the higher your levels of body fat when you start, so that essentially the more obese or overweight somebody is starting, actually the quicker they can look to lose weight. How motivated are you to diet at the start? For most people, motivation is very, very high at the start of a diet. And therefore, this could be something that we could essentially take advantage of and look to start a diet with a slightly more aggressive rate of weight loss before moving into a slightly slower approach. Does losing quicker motivate you more? So this is something as well. For some people, they can't get into a diet. They can't even get started if they notice that they're only, say, dropping half a pound to a pound per week. They find that very, very demotivating. So for somebody like this, that individual, telling them that they have to lose weight very slowly is probably not going to be the most effective thing for them. On the opposite hand, if somebody's starting with not much weight to lose already, and actually they're looking to try and build some habits, they don't want it to feel like they're dieting too much, this individual could be go for a much slower approach. Ask yourself, how much are you willing to suffer? So obviously, the greater your rate of weight loss, the more restrictive you're going to need to be with your diet, the more negative effects you're going to feel of dieting. So if you go obviously into a very, very low calorie diet, you will notice there are going to be issues with your energy levels are going to be down. You'll probably feel a little bit more lethargic. You're certainly going to feel a little bit hungrier, and you're probably going to see performance decrease a little bit. So ask yourself that, how much are you willing to suffer for that period you're going to be dieting? Next thing, and pretty much probably the most important thing when picking how fast you want to look to lose weight is, what is your previous relationship with food? If you have tried a faster approach to weight loss and essentially every time just come out of it and rebounded back up to your previous weight, if you're that kind of typical yo-yo dieter and you've never tried a slower, more sustainable approach, maybe in that case, it is something that you want to think about doing. However, if you've got never, this could be your first time you've ever gone to a diet, it could be the first time you've ever thought about looking to lose any weight. Maybe at this point you may think, actually, I'm just going to get in and out a lot quicker. I'm willing to suffer for it. I don't have any kind of previous issues with bad relationship with food. Are you looking to practice behavior change? So it's much easier to build habits when they're being done in a much more slow and gradual calorie deficit. So certainly, if you're feeling very, very hungry all the time, it's going to be pretty hard to try and build new habits. So if that's something you're looking to do, then maybe you need to target a slower rate of weight loss. Do you have any performance goals? So if you've still got goals that are gym related, if you're still looking to try and improve your strength in the gym, then the larger the calorie deficit you go into, the faster your rate of weight loss, the more it's going to hinder and impact on that. So this is something to ask yourself, is actually, is your performance in the gym important to you? It certainly is to me, which is why I typically, will take a much more slow and sustained approach. And then, does your current lifestyle suit a fast, a slow, or a moderate weight loss? So whilst you may want to go for a fast speed of weight loss, if you had, let's say, a very busy social life coming up for the next month or two, it's possible that this isn't the right time to go for that kind of approach. Maybe you would look to go into something a little bit slower, a little bit more moderate. Calories. So I had to cover this. So calorie is the amount of energy needed to heat 1 liter of water. That's meant to say 1 degree centigrade. I don't know why I put 10. So essentially, the amount of energy needed to heat 1 liter of water, 1,000 grams of water, by 1 degree centigrade, not 10 degrees centigrade. So whilst food has different calorie values and may act differently within the body, a calorie is still a calorie. A calorie is just a unit of energy, the same way that a gram is a gram. Now, typically what people kind of fall into with this is they say, well, if calories doesn't matter, then it doesn't matter what I eat, as long as calories are controlled. And this has been shown in many different research studies. There was a study that a doctor did where he ate nothing but Twinkies, and I think he had something else in there for 30 days, and he lost something like 10 pounds, something like that. It was a very, very large amount of weight that he had lost in that time, and because he controlled the calories. Now, what I'm saying is that, a calorie isn't just a calorie, and that it doesn't matter what you eat, because obviously food has other benefits that come along with it more than just its calorie intake. And the way I've always liked to look at this is, when you go to the petrol station, there might be three pumps. There might be a super, there might be a premium, and there might be just your regular unleaded. Obviously, the amount of liters of that fuel is the same regardless of which one you choose, but obviously one is going to have slightly more beneficial effects on your car. I'm not a mechanic, I have literally no idea if that's true or not, but at least that's what my understanding of it would be. Same thing goes for food, is that, alongside the calories that you have in those foods, you also have things like fiber, protein, vitamins, and minerals. And so it's important that whilst we are thinking about our calorie intake, we're not just so solely focused on that we forget about the quality of our diet. Okay, so energy balance. So what I want to sort of show you here is essentially what makes up the amount of calories you burn over the course of the day. So often you'll have heard people talk about this as TDEE, which stands for total daily energy expenditure. And it essentially comes up, is built up from a few different things. So the energy we put into our body, the calories we put into the body, are used either for work, lost as heat for maintaining core temperature, or stored as body fat, muscle, so obviously muscle tissue, or glycogen that is stored within the muscles and the liver. So glycogen is just a kind of a long strand of carbohydrate, and that's just stored within our liver and our muscles as an easily accessible form of energy when we need it. Now, typically when people think about metabolism, they think about all of these things to combine. They say, oh, my metabolism is slow, when the reality is it's made up of these different things. So if we start from the bottom of this pyramid, we have BMR, which stands for basal metabolic rate. And it's essentially just the amount of calories our body burns at rest in order to stay alive. So it's things you can't affect, you can't adjust or control. It's just how many calories your body's going to burn in order to do all the stuff, all the processes it needs to do on a day-to-day basis. The next thing we have is movement. So now, obviously, this is something that we can affect, our movement. And, I've put in here as sort of 15%, 15%. It can be way higher or way lower, depending upon what you do. So in an average individual, about 15% of their calories burn over the course of the day. As an average, it could be, anywhere from kind of 5 all the way up to 50% if somebody's an endurance athlete. Is burnt from the exercise they do. Then we have what's called NEAT and NEPA. So NEAT stands for non-exercise activity thermometer. So you don't have to worry about all these words. All essentially NEAT is it's all the movement that you do throughout the day that you don't really think about. It can be fidgeting, it can be me sitting in this seat here and kind of rocking side to side. It can be facial tone. It can, like I say, be all these things that are subconscious that we don't control. Then we have NEPA, and NEPA stands for non-exercise physical activity. So this is steps. This isn't your formal exercise. This isn't you going to the gym. This is just all the movement that you do outside that's not formal exercise. And then finally at the top, we have digestion. This is known as TEF, thermic effective feeding, and essentially about 10% of all the calories you eat are used just for digesting that food. So if you were to eat 2,000 calories in a day and you had a split of protein, carbs, and fats that was relatively even, about 10%, about 200 of those calories would be used just for digesting food. So there we can see that really the only one we can affect is that middle bar. It's our movement, it's our exercise, and it's our NEAT and our NEPA. And if you're already performing a decent amount of exercise, then we know that it's actually our general movement on a day-to-day basis, the amount of steps we're doing, whether we're taking the stairs or going up the elevator. Those things are going to have a much bigger impact upon how many calories we burn over the course of the day, which is why it's usually my first port of call. Rather than upping our activity, rather than massively upping our cardio, it's to try and get people just moving more, because it's going to have a much bigger impact upon their weight loss. So after going through that, you may be wondering, okay, well, how do I figure this out? And you can find, a million and one different calculators if you go into Google. However, this is pretty much as accurate as any of them. So take your weight in kilos, and if you're a man, times it by 24. If you're a woman, times it by 22. Once you've done that, that's going to essentially work out that BMR for you, that the amount of calories you burn at rest just to stay alive. Then multiply this by your physical activity level. And I don't know if you can see that well enough there, but your physical activity level is just typically a rating, and it's usually given anywhere between 1.1 all the way up to around about 2. And this multiplier is all based upon how active you are in general over the course of the day. So as you can see, 1.3 would be very light, just typical office job, sitting, studying, little walking throughout the day. You're not doing much whatsoever, and therefore you're not burning many more calories above what you would burn just from lying in bed all day. Then at the other end of the scale, we have moderate to hard physical activity, minimum 8 hours per day. And this is, the individual who's laboring all day. This could be your professional athlete who's doing a huge amount of training per day. And most people are typically going to fall, between kind of 1.3 to 1.5, somewhere like that. I'm a PT, and yet I probably only still fall from 1.5 to 1.6 because I just spend a little bit of my day walking about. So once you know that maintenance level, this is where you can start looking at, okay, so I know that that's how many calories I need per day in order to maintain my weight roughly. And then you know that if you times that by 7, take that many calories over the week, that's how many calories over the week you would need roughly. Now what you can do is you can go away and just try eating that many calories for 2 weeks. Take a daily weigh-in, so take a weigh-in every single day for those 14 days, and then compare your first 7 days average versus your second 7 days average. Based off of that, you're going to be able to figure out whether that was actually a really good estimate for your maintenance intake. So if your weight went up, then actually your maintenance is slightly lower. If your weight went down, then actually you can maintain weight slightly higher. And then based off of that, you can look to set yourself a bit of a calorie deficit. You can look to start, pulling calories back in from that number in order to start losing weight and losing fat. Right, so I wanted to look into those of you who are weekend warriors. I know that for most of my life I have been. Essentially, I like a beer at the weekend, I like a Domino's, I like to push my calorie intake up at the weekends, as most people do. However, when people go into a diet, there's this kind of sometimes a little bit of a misunderstanding feeling that they have to make every day a diet day, that a diet is solely restrictive. It means that you can never have any periods of time where you're actually able to enjoy yourself a little bit more and let loose a little bit more. So I take a much different approach, and I really prefer my clients not to make every day a diet day. So this is an example how you could essentially take a 1800 calories, and let's say this individual maintains at 2500, so the top of that chart there. If they were trying to eat about 700 calories less per day, that would equate to about 1800 over the course of the week. Straight away, that can feel actually quite restrictive, never being able to go above a certain amount, always having that kind of limit that is fixed. Now we have an intermittent approach. We can see here that actually we could look to take some slightly lower days over the course of the week to enable ourselves to have a few slightly higher days. This is something that some people use with a fasting approach, where they'd have, let's say, 1 or 2 days a week where they take calories very, very low, and therefore they can shift those calories over to a different day. And essentially what this just does is it just provides a little bit of a psychological break from a diet. And I typically will get most people to aim to have at least 1 to 2 days per week where they aim to eat still controlled, but aim to eat calories up at around about their maintenance intake. So that day is not a diet day, it's a day to reset, recover, enjoy some of the things that you might not be able to get in your normal diet day. And that essentially helps us build that really important level of adherence that I spoke about to their diet. Right, will alcohol stop you losing fat? So I'm sure a few of you are leaning in for this one because it's probably something we've heard a lot about. Alcohol calories all get turned into fat, and it doesn't matter if you're in a deficit for the day. If you drink a glass of wine or a load of, well, bottle of wine, and it's all just going to turn into fat and it won't matter. Okay, so here you go, real simple little flow chart. Is your alcohol intake taking you out of a calorie deficit? No, of course it won't stop you losing fat. Yes, it will stop you losing fat, just like excess calories from anything would. So if you want a bit of proof, they did a good study where they took two groups. So one of the groups, they were given alcohol, but the alcohol replaced other calories in the diet so that the subjects were still eating at maintenance. So when I say energy balance, it just means maintenance. They were eating an amount that would have them staying the same weight. The second group were given alcohol on top of their normal calorie intake. So obviously they were given a bit of a calorie surplus, more calories than they needed. So what did they find? So researchers then looked at the fat balance. So how much fat was gained or lost by the body over 20.5 hours. So over that period of time after they were given the alcohol, I think the subjects were given it over 3.5 hours, and then they looked at it for the next 20.5 hours so they could see over a 24-hour period. When the subjects were in energy balance, consuming alcohol suppressed, so it stopped them burning fat for around about 6 hours. However, for the rest of the day, fat burning actually increased. So over the 20.5 hours, there was no effect of alcohol on energy balance. So, giving somebody alcohol, getting them to eat at maintenance, didn't actually affect how much net fat they had over the course of that day. They essentially had a point of the day where they burnt a little bit less fat, and then as soon as the alcohol was out of the system, fat burning went up higher, and they ended up with that same net amount. So we conclude that alcohol has a fat sparing effect similar to that of carbohydrate, and will only cause fat gain when consumed in excess of normal energy needs. So it's only if alcohol intake is taking you out of a calorie deficit will you see negative effects on your fat loss from doing it. So what does everyone think it does? Alcohol does inhibit fat burning during its metabolism, but as I mentioned, that does not affect fat burn balance over 24 hours if you do not consume more calories than you are burning. Alcohol may increase appetite and lead to higher food intake. So we typically know that if we're going out for a load of beers, it's probably going to end in a kebab or a pizza or a burger, because we essentially bring down our inhibitions. We don't really give a shit about our diet when we're half cut. Hangovers may reduce your general activity levels the next day. So as we spoke about that, non-exercise physical activity, and actually the subconscious levels of movement, it's probably going to come down the next day because you're probably going to be zoned out a little bit if you're feeling hungover. Therefore, you've burnt less calories. And alcoholic drinks are typically high in calories, and it makes it obviously a lot easier to overconsume calories. It's what they would call empty calories, because if we kind of go back to my little analogy about super premium and unleaded, it's not really giving us any other nutritional benefit above just its energy density, its calorie intake. Right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about damage limitation strategies. So it's not in MyFitnessPal. Obviously, if you're tracking calories through an app like MyFitnessPal and you see something that's not in there, sometimes it can be hard to go, was I over for that day? Really, really difficult for me to know and get an understanding of. So some damage limitation strategies that I recommend: there's carb and fat separation, carb bunching, intermittent fasting, and a protein sparing fast. So what I want to do is, if you go to your files tab, where is that? That one is down there. You will see that I basically talk you through all of these in that file there. So what you should be able to do is download that file, and it talks you through it. Now I'm going to just cover it quickly now. So carb and fat separation is essentially not having a high carb and a high fat food combined together at a meal. So ideally what you'd want to go for is you'd want to go for something that's high protein and high to moderate in carbohydrate and then low in fat, or you could go high protein, high to moderate in fat and then low carbohydrate. So by not mixing those two together, by not mixing high fat and high carbohydrate foods, we're able to reduce our calorie intake. And this is something that's really useful to use if you're at a restaurant where they don't have, nutritional information on the menu, they don't have it in MyFitnessPal. You can look to go, okay, right, well, I know that if I have a steak and a salad, I know it's high fat, high protein, low carbohydrate. Vice versa, if you had, let's say, chicken pasta, it's like a chicken and tomato pasta, you know that that's going to be high carbohydrate, high protein, low fat. And therefore, you're able to just limit your intake relatively well because you're not combining those very calorie dense foods. We have carb bunching. So this is essentially where you take carbohydrates out of one meal and then you push it onto another meal. Really, really useful, especially if you've got like a big meal in the evening and you just decide to take all your carbohydrates out of your midday meal or out of your first meal of the day and actually place that in your evening and therefore give yourself more calories to play with. Intermittent fasting, so this is essentially just having particular times or days where you limit calorie intake to enable yourself to have higher intake on other days, and this was that kind of bar chart I showed. And then protein sparing fast, which is my personal sort of go-to approach when I'm doing something like trying to reduce my body fat levels down, and I still want to help maintain as much muscle mass. And it might be that I spend most of the day just eating protein, making sure I've got fruit and veg in my diet, so I've got some vitamins and minerals in, and therefore I've really reduced my calorie intake down, and it gives me a bit more to play with in the evening if I'm going out drinking or if I'm going out for a meal. So yeah, as I mentioned there, if you have a look in that files tab, you'll be able to sort of see a little bit more about those. So tracking and non-tracking approaches. So that's that dieting method there. Okay, so tracking versus non-tracking. So tracking would be, there's many different ways you could do it, but tracking is going to be either a few things. It's either going to be, tracking calories. It could be that you're tracking, your protein portions. It could be that you're just tracking, let's say, your flexible days at the weekend. It's essentially, keeping some data about your food and getting an idea about roughly what is going in over the course of the day. Then we have non-tracking approaches, and non-tracking approaches are the ones I've mentioned that are in that sort of files tab, and they're essentially things where you're doing them kind of automatically to help limit intake. So the pros of tracking. So the numbers don't lie. So if you're tracking your calories, the numbers aren't going to lie. You're going to know exactly what's going in, and that means it's easy to adjust. So if you're not seeing progress, then obviously we know straight away actually you want to be adjusting your calorie intake over the course of the week down in order to help with that fat loss. It can override hunger. So essentially, rather than us, just trusting our hunger, which is probably notoriously not that great a judgment, it enables us to just go, well, I know that I don't actually need to eat because I've had a good amount of calories already go in today. If it's possible, it is optimal because we've got all the numbers, we've got the black and white, we've got all the data, and therefore it does make it much, much easier to know what's happening and know when to make adjustments. And it does give us immediate feedback. We can look at a meal and go, oh shit, that was a ton of calories. I better reduce at my next meal in order to hit for the day. However, cons, it does require us to have some education in terms of, foods that are high in protein, foods that are high in fiber, what has a good amount of nutrient density, so what's got some good vitamins and minerals. If we're just going, right, there's your calories, go away, do that, this is where we do run into this whole kind of, if it fits your macros, junk food approach. It's time consuming, so most people who do track, it becomes a bit of second nature, but certainly at the start, it's something that you got to remember to track it in. It can be a bit of a ball ache. Obsessive tendencies. I've certainly run into this myself. I imagine some people who are listening to this, who I know are personal trainers, may have run into this themselves as well, of you literally can't think about a meal without thinking about tracking it in MyFitnessPal. It's not really a great place to get into if it's something you're doing long term. If you've got 1,000 day streak going on MyFitnessPal, maybe that's not a particularly good thing. It's not always possible. So as I spoke about, kind of if you're out and about at a restaurant, you may not always know exactly what's going in, and therefore your tracking is perhaps not that accurate, not that worthwhile. And then it's not intuitive. So, if you're just basing it upon, I've got this many calories to eat over the course of the day, maybe there's times you're eating when you're not actually that hungry. I know I've certainly been guilty of this in the past, of going, oh, I've got 400 more calories to play with in the evening. I'm not actually hungry, but I know that I've got 400 to play with, and I'll go eat a whole tub of Halo Top. I wouldn't have done that if I hadn't have been thinking about it. And actually, I've just probably shortchanged myself a little bit in my fat loss phase. Non-tracking approaches. So non-tracking usually means there's some kind of rules or guidelines. A non-tracking approach would be something like a ketogenic diet, where you are completely removing one of your macronutrients. You're completely removing all your calories from carbohydrates. Doesn't really require any education, because all somebody needs to know is that's got carbs in, I can't eat that. So it can be a little bit easier sometimes when people I like a guideline, I like to do this, and this is why most weight loss brands that we can think of, Cambridge diet, Atkins diet, Weight Watchers, Slimming World, usually based off of rules and guidelines. Less time consuming. If you do the rules and the guidelines, you don't have to think about it again. Possibly less obsessive. I'm only saying possibly less obsessive because some people can start getting themselves into a position of thinking that a certain food is what's causing them to gain weight because it's on a banned list. It's always possible. You're always able to go with a guideline and a rule, no matter where you're at. And it can sometimes be seamless when somebody just kind of eases their way into it. It can seem like this was the easiest thing ever. Why didn't I just do it in the past? And something like, clean eating kind of probably falls into this, is that it's a way of creating a calorie deficit, with somebody just by going, right, I just want you to eat, foods that are, all whole foods, all single ingredient foods. Cons. More restrictive. If there's some guidelines and there's some rules in place, it's likely some foods are probably going to be a bit more restricted or a bit more excluded. Doesn't quite have the flexibility of, tracking calorie intake. Hunger can be an issue. So if you don't know much about food already, if you don't know what's going to fill you up and what's, got a good amount of fiber in it and what's got, a good amount of protein in it, then it might mean that you get into the end of the day and actually going, oh, I'm starving, because you're wasting a ton of calories on avocados and, a lot of salmon. Less food variety, possibly, if you're, like I say, following a ketogenic diet, it's likely that you've just cut out a whole macronutrient. Social situations can be hard. If somebody's got a pizza, buffet or something like that, and actually, there's no place for that in your diet, then all of a sudden you've got to just rely on your willpower not to have any at all. And it is a lot harder to adjust. If you don't know exactly what's going in, it means it's a bit more difficult for us to know where the bottleneck is, what's causing the problem, and how we adjust from there. Okay, so let's look into a few different things. So why have we all got that friend who never gains weight? And actually, for me, this is my wife. So, my wife has always been somebody who actually just never puts weight on. She really, really struggles to put weight on. And for most people, this just pisses them off, because most of us are in the opposite camp. We actually struggle to get it off. So if we look at the differences here, we have active exerciser, non-active exerciser, non-active non-exerciser, and then a yo-yo dieter. And these are all, for this example here, they're all same weight individuals. So what you'll notice is the BMR is all the same, apart from in the yo-yo dieter, whose BMR, whose metabolism has essentially been depressed from years and years of gaining and losing the same weight. But the biggest thing we notice that's different here is this NEAT level. And this is why I've sort of spoken about this kind of previously in the past. The kind of, your general movement is the biggest factor in the difference between these two individuals here. And what you'll typically find is with the people who really struggle to gain weight, they'll usually be in this camp or this camp. They'll usually be an active exerciser or an active non-exerciser. I should have included that as a bar, actually. And they'll just be moving loads. They'll move a ton, whether they think about it or not. My wife can do 10,000 steps in the house, even, in lockdown. She's still always just constantly moving without even thinking about it. And these are the individuals who usually just never seem to gain weight. They could be the same weight as us. They feel, you feel like they just eat everything. Why are they not gaining like, let's say you are? And there you go. That's the reason. Okay, I don't have the willpower. This is another big one. This is something that a lot of people can tell themselves at the start of a diet, or anytime they fall off a diet, they feel like it's because they've got no willpower. When actually we know that this just isn't the case. Willpower is not a massive contributor to the success of a diet. And first of all, you got to ask yourself, how do you identify yourself? Do you identify yourself as somebody who has strong willpower or somebody who has very weak willpower? What they found when they did a little study on this is that individuals who class themselves as having very, very strong willpower, after a day of excess food consumption, reduce their intake down the next day subconsciously a lot better than those who had identified themselves as having very weak willpower. And this was all subconscious. They weren't thinking about reducing their intake the next day. They just generally did it. And how you identify yourself is a really important thing, because it's going to change how you approach things as you move into a diet, how you feel about things. If you're always identifying yourself as, oh, I've got really weak willpower, it's probably going to start veering you towards the idea of giving in to slightly more cravings and things like that. And then you need to look at how your environment helps or hinders this identity. So some of the really interesting stuff that they've done is looking at eating and mindfulness around eating, and how an environment affects calorie intake. So this was the M&M study. So they took 24 chronic dieters and then seated them either next to or far away from a bowl of overflowing M&Ms. Those that sat closest were more tempted, thought about the M&Ms more, and also had greater intake calories-wise of those M&Ms. And if you work in an office environment, or were working in an office environment, you may have noticed this. You may have noticed that if there's food that's present and there's buffets near you and things like that, it's really, really difficult not to think about it all the time, as opposed to not having it in your mind. And out of sight, out of mind is such a true saying. It is so apt when it comes to dieting and things like that. And this is why setting up your diet for success is largely going to be based upon how well you set up your environment around you. So if you go to if I come into my offers and I'm going to go start offer, and hopefully you will see this. This is a form that you can fill out that you can sort of take around the home with you. And essentially, it's going to just tell you whether your home is working for or against you. Let me just come up to the next one. So go around with that. It will take about 20 to 30 minutes. Just go in against this link, save the link so you can do it after this webinar or whenever you've got some free time. And this is one of the biggest things I notice as common traits among people who don't struggle so much with dieting, who keep the weight off a lot better, is usually they score much higher on these environment MOTs. Because we're most likely to fall off our diet at home, in the evening, and when we're bored and stressed. And so if your home is not perhaps set up particularly well for that, it's going to be much easier for you to grab the tub of Ben & Jerry's that's in the cupboard, or grab the pack of biscuits that are left out on the kitchen side and in view. However, if obviously those things are not in your home, or they are, let's say, hidden away, they're in a space that's working for you, you're much more likely to make better decisions and not have to rely on willpower, because willpower is like a muscle. It gets fatigued, it gets used up throughout the day. And ideally in a diet, I want somebody to rely on willpower as little as possible, because it's not a sustainable way of having to approach a diet, just constantly battling willpower. Right. Take a break. So why taking a break from your diet might be just what you need. Okay, so this may seem like a weird concept, but I just want to show you kind of a little study that looked into this. So this was called the Matador study. What they did is they took 51 men and split them into two groups. And they had them diet in different ways. So they had group one, who did 16 weeks of unbroken dieting. So they were in a calorie deficit that was assigned to them, and they stayed in that the whole time. And this, by the way, was all conducted via food that was given to them. It was essentially to take out any of the, perhaps cheating that could go on in the diet. Group 2 had 8 2-week periods of dieting with 7 phases of 2 weeks at maintenance calories. So their diet lasted a bit longer. It lasted 30 weeks as opposed to 16 weeks. But obviously every 2 weeks they had a 2-week break of dieting where their food was brought up to their maintenance. They made sure that they were maintaining weight for those 2 weeks, and then they put them back into a calorie deficit. So what did they find? Well, at the end of the study, group 2 saw on average a 5-kilo increase in fat loss. So on average, the individuals in group 2 lost 5 kilos more body fat. That's, what's that, 11 pounds more body fat. It's a pretty huge number. They also saw 400 calorie less reduction in the total amount of calories they burnt over the course of the day. Now, I don't know about you. You may have, you may feel that you could have coped quite well with the 16 weeks of unbroken dieting. But if I look at a diet and I know that for 16 weeks, I'm going to have to think about dieting, I'm going to have to think about a calorie deficit, my motivation to do that does sometimes feel like it would wane quite a bit. And this is typically how I approach things in the past. These days, when I work with clients, when I work with myself doing kind of things like this, I will typically get somebody to go into a diet break every 4 to 8 weeks based upon the individual, based upon how much weight they've got to lose, based upon how much general diet fatigue they're feeling. So this is something to certainly think about, is actually, looking ahead of time and thinking, right, when do I want to, take a break from dieting? When I want to practice maintaining body weight? Because weight loss isn't really our problem. It's maintaining lost weight that's our problem. And so this is why taking a break from a diet is something that's really, really, really beneficial, and something I would recommend if you've never thought about doing it before. So when you do this, base it on the following. So first of all, how much weight has been lost? If you've already lost a huge amount of weight, it's likely that you probably want to start looking to try and take a bit of a diet break. How motivated are you feeling? So the lower your motivation levels are, the more a diet break is probably required. How are your energy levels? So if your energy levels are through the floor, then it's definitely going to be a good idea to push calories up for 1 or 2 weeks. Doesn't even have to be 1 or 2 weeks. It could be, 3 or 4 days. How are your hunger levels? Hunger levels are always going to rise as you move through a diet. It's just how the body's, physiology works. How restricted do you feel? If you're feeling extremely restricted on your diet, then it might be that you need that week or so just to bring calories up slightly, still control them, but add a little bit extra, a little bit more food in. And then how are you sleeping? Sleep is usually one of our first keys and first signs and signals of when somebody is actually starting to feel diet fatigue. Usually their sleep will be impaired. They'll be going to bed feeling a bit hungry. And actually at this point, it's like, right, we need to take a step away from the diet. Right, so how do we keep it off? So we don't have a weight loss problem. We have a weight loss maintenance problem. Everybody has lost weight at some point. The problem is most people have regained that lost weight. And if you're a yo-yo dieter, if you kind of put the same weight on and off, a lot, you'll know this. You'll know that this is really the hard part. So what do people who keep weight off have as common traits? Well, this is what the research shows. So first of all, they'll have achieved a weight loss goal. I mean, it's pretty obvious, you're not going to have had a problem maintaining weight if you never lost it in the first place. So they've achieved a weight loss goal. Usually they've lost weight quicker at the start. This feeds back into that, if I lose quick, am I going to put it back on quick? No, it's not true. It doesn't tend to hold up in the research that way. Typically, they saw more initial weight loss at the start, which led to higher motivation levels, higher buy-in in the initial first place. They had a physically active lifestyle. There was some good stuff done on there. Do you remember the TV program, The Biggest Loser? What they showed with that, and they followed them up, I think about 6 years after they'd been on the show, and they found that most of them regained all of the weight they'd lost. Stones and stones and stones had been regained when they followed them up. The ones who had kept most of the weight off were the ones who actually had the highest levels of daily activity, which was not just exercise related. So steps, general activity, those were the people who actually maintained weight loss. And so whilst I've said it before, and I'll say it again, exercise isn't the greatest thing in the world for weight loss, but it is vitally important for weight loss maintenance, and that is shown. Regular meal rhythm, so eating at roughly same times each day, just getting yourself into a bit of a structure and a bit of routine is very, very important. They typically have lower levels of dietary fats. They typically have lower calorie intake of fat. Doesn't mean fat's bad. Obviously, we need fat in our diet, but these people tend to consume slightly less fat on average. That's obviously an average. I'm sure there's a huge amount of individual variation within that, but this is something that they typically show. They eat more healthy foods, so more nutrient-dense foods in their diet, keeps them fuller for longer. It's kind of a no-brainer. Reduce snacking frequency. They typically don't have as many snacks in their normal day, which is why if you're somebody who's a grazer and has always struggled with putting weight on on and off, it may be an idea if you start looking at having less, slightly bigger meals and reducing snacking frequency down. They had flexible and inclusive diets, so most of the time their diets weren't based upon restrictions of food groups or restrictions of an exact food in general. They were usually inclusive of most foods and therefore felt less restrictive. They self-monitored, so however you may feel about the weight scale, it does tend to show that as an average, people maintain weight better when they still keep an eye on it. It doesn't mean you have to get a step on it every day, but still keeping an eye on it is important. Still making sure you pay attention to how many calories are in certain foods. Definitely important. Otherwise, what gets what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. There you go. Coping with cravings. People who kept the weight off better tended to cope with cravings a little bit better. And the diets were autonomous. So autonomy just means the ability to choose for yourself. So they were typically diets where people had choices in what they did rather than just being forced to do something by a coach, a friend, a doctor. They were typically things that they had chosen for themselves. Okay. Right, so next one. Cool. So does anyone have any questions at all? Anything at all that they've put? I'll have a little look through the chat. Let's just have a look. Is that Dr. Mike in the back of the slide? Kit Kat, yeah, cool. So no questions at all at the minute. Like I say, if you've got anything, obviously, please give me a shout. If you can't think of anything, obviously, on the call on the webinar right now, just give me a message. More than happy to go through anything with anyone. Yeah, lovely. So what I've done is I've just put a little link to the side there. If anyone wants to book a call to chat through, anything to do with their fat loss journey, if you want to book a call to talk about some coaching or anything like that at all, then by all means, look to try and book in through there. It's got my diary. And as I mentioned, if you have any comments, anything at all, any questions, please just give me a shout. You can do it through my Instagram, my Facebook at Built by Brown PT for both of those, or you can go to my website, builtbybrown.co.uk. And yeah, I enjoyed this. Hope everyone else has too. And have a lovely evening. Oh, there we go. Ellie, I have a client who is doing, we got loads now. Okay, cool. Right. Here we go. How many calories less than your maintenance is a deficit? So any calories less than the maintenance, is technically a deficit, but obviously the closer that deficit is to maintenance, the more you're going to start to tightrope, the more it's going to be that, you won't be sure if you're losing. Typically, I would recommend the slowest that most people go for is about a 15% calorie deficit. And the highest that anyone goes for is about a 40% calorie deficit. Anything above that, and we start running into issues with losing too much in the way of muscle mass, energy levels dropping off of a cliff quite quickly, performance levels decreasing. Anything less than a 15% deficit, and people just tend to find it's a little bit too slow for motivation's sake, so they end up just feeling, just a little bit kind of bored of the whole thing. Next one. How often do you review calories for fat loss? So, I mean, I would typically not look to reduce calories before seeing about 2 weeks of maintaining weight. And that's in males. In women, it can sometimes be a bit longer just due to, cycle, time of the month can affect what we can see on the scales a little bit. So typically somebody's got to be plateaued for at least 2 weeks for me to look to adjust calories down, because there will always be times in a diet where, you know, actually your average weight just stalls for a bit and then just takes a bit of patience and we see it drop down. So yeah, never usually losing, trying to change any quicker than that. How can you lose weight while keeping muscle mass? Weight train and protein intake. You know, there's been rugby players who have done 40% calorie deficits and weight trained, had a decently adequate level of protein intake and didn't lose muscle mass whilst they were dieting. Diet breaks, including diet breaks, as I spoke about, is a good way of making sure you hold on to a little bit of muscle tissue. So, you know, making sure you don't spend too long in a very aggressive diet. And like I say, weight training is the main stimulus. You know, if you weight train, you know, you're going to keep most of your muscle even when you diet. Okay, that's the end of that first question. So I have a client who's doing a 12-week plan in week 10 now, and weight has stabilized. It's for a photo shoot. Do you recommend a refeed for 2 days? So this is going to be one of the things I would ideally see some more details about what they've kind of previously done in the past. If they are pretty confident and you are pretty confident they're still in a calorie deficit, if they're feeling perhaps a little bit tired, if you know, they're noticing that their kind of motivation for training is a little bit down, if they are noticing they feel a bit puffy and a bit, you know, kind of water retained, then yeah, I would certainly recommend taking calories up for a little while, if, you know, especially if you haven't done it already, taking them up to maintenance, anywhere up to maybe 20% above maintenance for a few days, and seeing how they get on. The likelihood is they're going to sleep much better, they're going to chill out a little bit, they're going to get a nice psychological break from the diet, and you know, they're just going to all of a sudden help, you know, release a little bit of water retention. So yeah, I would look at it in one of two ways. You know, 2 days at maintenance is not going to affect how they look on shoot day to any noticeable difference whatsoever, but it might make them feel a little bit better beforehand, and it you know, might just help them move and train a little bit better over the next couple of weeks. How many of your calories should be protein? So rather than looking at it as protein, what you want to do is you want to look at it more like how many grams per kilo of body weight, because that way it scales based upon you as an individual rather than based upon your calorie intake, which could be a deficit, could be a surplus. So anywhere between 1.6 grams all the way up to about 2.4 grams per kilo of body weight is a nice range to hit between. Certainly, you know, if you're in a big calorie deficit, I would go on the higher end of protein intake, because it's going to be more filling. It's going to be, you know, more likely to help you hold on to a bit more muscle mass. If you're eating at maintenance, there's certainly no reason why you'd need to go above 1.6 to 1.8 grams per kilo of body weight. Thanks, Fraser. Thank you, Craig. Glad you enjoyed it. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Davey. So what are your thoughts on water intake? 2 to 3 liters per day. A good rule of thumb is around about half a liter of water for every 25 kilos of body weight. That's a decent rule of thumb to use there. Scales quite well towards most people. Cool, right. That's us done. Yeah, glad you all enjoyed that, guys. And if you need anything else, obviously, please give me a shout. Have a lovely evening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and all that. And speak to you all soon.